Pete Buttigieg was right last night when he said that Republicans and other critics are going to call Democrats socialists or who knows what, no matter what policies they run on, whether they run on something that's relatively centrist or something out of the Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren playbook. Republicans are probably going to call them socialists. Some are going to call them communists. It kind of doesn't matter. And I should caveat right up front, I didn't watch the debates last night. I'm working. I have things to do. And so I'm not going to do punditry. For one thing, I don't think punditry is healthy, typically speaking. So I'm not going to predict what will happen. I'm not going to say that, if Bernie Sanders runs as a moderate, he will win. Or if John Hickenlooper runs on a radical plan, he will win Colorado. We don't know those things. And the people who say they do shouldn't be put on TV because they don't know either. So what I do want to talk about is what we do know because we've already seen it. And that's concerning a claim that we've seen not just in the debate last night, but throughout this campaign and throughout many others, right? Which is this notion that radical economic transformation of the US economy is too out there a proposal for American voters to accept. So I don't know and won't predict whether or not they will accept some version of that in 2020, but we can talk about whether they have in the past, right? This is a known thing, so let's talk about that for a minute. So imagine that you were running for president and you said, under my ideas, here's what you'll be able to have. You'll be able to have a 4-person household, 2 adults, 2 children, in which only one of those adults has to work. One income will be enough for the entire family to have a house with a pool. I'm not talking about in the center of Manhattan. I'm talking about out in whatever America you want to idealize as the real America, which of course, I hope it's understood. I reject that notion. But out somewhere where real estate prices aren't nuts, you'll be able to have a house with a pool. You'll go to a job and actually come back in time for dinner at night. You'll have a car. You will have the opportunity to go on vacation on a regular basis. You will be able to send your children to college, a good college, where they will get educations that will enable them to progress further economically than you are, without either of you coming out of it with crushing or even significant debt. And then at the end of that, you and your non-working spouse, of whichever gender or genders you want to make that mix, will get to retire at an age where you can actually enjoy your life and continue going on vacation in retirement. This sounds like a radical thing. Oh, and by the way, your health bills won't bankrupt you. This sounds like a radical thing. This was the American economy in my lifetime. And it was achieved in the lion's share of the economic structure that created this dynamic was achieved by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was called a socialist during the many times he ran for and won the presidency. And he was not only popular enough on the force of his personality to win in his lifetime, despite and or because of exactly those attacks from the gentry of the time on him, but because of the substantive material impact Roosevelt had on the nation's economic well-being, right? You had families with nothing more than a high school education getting good jobs that lasted cradle to grave and enabled them to to have a family, to have a life, to have a life-work mix and balance, and then put your kids one rung higher than you were on the economic ladder. And because he did that, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the most popular American politician for decades. Well after his death, you would find his picture up on the walls, sometimes across from Kennedy's or maybe MLK's, for decades. These were staples in working class, however you want to define that, homes of white families, black families, you name it. So this notion that the American public will somehow be scared off by radical transformation, it might be right in 2020. I'm not going to predict the future because a lot of it depends on how those messages are executed. But the notion that it's somehow anathema to the American spirit, whatever that is, or that it's got no grounding in American history is utterly wrong. And with that, I'm gonna go over here and see what you guys have to say about it in the chat box. And I see you've been going, so I'm curious to see what you have to say. A dingo ate me baby says Sanders took the gloves off, and of course Fox News calling him an angry old man yelling. Well, in fairness, he is an angry old man yelling. He's angry, he's old, he's a man, and on more than one occasion, he's yelling. So, accuracy in media, right? A Sear, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, A-C-Y-R, says, Biden is the only way. Bernie and Warren are too radical for middle American. So, how do you know that? You don't know that. If Trump, and here's the other example I wanted to use. If Trump came out and said, as he almost did during his own campaign, that healthcare would be free for all Americans, do we really think his base would abandon him and say, you've gone too far, President Trump. This is it. This is the last straw. Free healthcare for me? No longer fearing personal bankruptcy because of healthcare bills? I can't handle anymore. You've pushed me too far. I will never support you again, President Trump. Give me John Hickenlooper in 2020. It's ridiculous. This notion that average Americans, especially those who don't vote, which is a ton of them, something like a quarter to a third to even more of Americans don't vote in the big elections. The notion that they don't vote, but they're also ideologically wedded to opposition to Northern European-style social democracy, or they favor free market capitalism with only Herbert Hoover's touch of regulation. I mean, it's just absurd. Most of these people aren't thinking about it because they are under the impression that it doesn't touch their lives. And frankly, when Democrats run on the idea that they don't want to impact people's lives too much, they give credence to that idea that that the government is not going to be an instrument of change in people's lives. As I just said, the most popular politician of modern American history, of the entire 20th century, not counting the spate of Kennedy nostalgia, but sustained popularity over time, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the guy who did exactly what you're saying middle America won't accept, more so, dramatically more so, than anyone else ever. So this notion that middle America won't accept it because they've got this ideological checklist is horseshit. Trump represents no coherent ideology, and yet a lot of these people voted for him. So maybe it does depend on who the messenger is and how that message is delivered. But this thinking, this blinkered thinking that Americans coming out of high school have carefully calculated, where do I stand on tariffs? Where do I stand on free trade? Where do I stand on the balance between economic health, the economic health of third world workers versus the regulatory burdens that would be put on those companies if they raise their environmental... I mean, the notion that people are making these calculations is just absurd, and there's no basis in reality whatsoever. What tends to happen with polling, which is generally, I think, a pernicious thing, but generally what happens with polling is polling questions about ideological viewpoints are phrased are termed in phrases that they recognize from their tribal affiliations, right? So people get conditioned to say, I want government out of my life, right? But what they don't mean by that is stop my Social Security checks. And probably what they don't mean by that is make my doctor bills go away, right? Whatever factual basis you might have for claiming that middle Americans don't want that Bernie and Warren are too radical, as you put it, for middle American, there's no empirical basis for saying that whatsoever. And I think there's enough material in the polling to suggest that the ideas that Warren and Sanders are espousing are broadly popular, even in middle America, however you want to define that. And we saw that with Obamacare, right? People said Obamacare is terrible. And the very same people on the very same polls would say Obamacare is terrible, and I like this element and this element and this element of it. They liked what's in it. They didn't like how it was framed. That's how shallow the thinking is around this stuff and uninformed, which means it's susceptible to winning, right? It's susceptible to politics. And the notion that the politics of being bold is somehow going to turn off voters, and the politics of pragmatism and realism are going to excite voters. Again, there's no basis for that, and plenty of counterexamples. A Dingo Ate Me Baby says Sanders wants to finish FDR's Economic Bill of Rights and his four freedoms, if I'm getting it right, and I don't remember what all of them are, but FDR's four freedoms are very radical. At least would be considered so today, less so then. Let's see what else we have. Devon Miller says, I wrote the damn bill. Yeah, I heard about the exchange, but I haven't seen it yet. It sounds like it was fun. A. Sear says, I'm from Seattle. They hate Bernie. Yeah, okay, maybe. I don't know what polling you've done in Seattle, but you might be right. I'm not saying Bernie will win. What I'm disputing is the notion that Bernie's ideas and Warren's ideas are too radical to win. Again, if President Trump advocated virtually anything on Warren or Sanders' agenda, even foreign policy, but let's stick to economic policy. Which of those ideas, excuse me, which Warren or Sanders idea do you think would cost Trump his base if he embraced it and defended it and asserted it with full-throated Trumpian vigor, right? Free college? Do we really think that Trump's base would abandon him over free college if he started going after the ivory tower and rich university presidents and corporate boards of trustees? Do we really think that that would turn off Trump's base? Chris Mack, or MC, says Bernie sold out his base to Killary / corrupt DNC. I don't know what that means, and I don't have the patience or energy to engage in whatever that means. Sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful or dismissive. I just mean I don't even know what the concept of sold out means. So I'm just not the person to address that kind of thing. Sorry. A. Sear says we want a young man like Biden. I assume that's meant to be amusing. A. Sear says name one progressive policy Bernie has passed. Just one. No, I won't. Again, the question isn't whether Bernie has succeeded in passing the legislation. The question is the popularity of what he has passed, right? Name one significant bill that any of these people have passed. I mean, what you basically, if you want to go back, it would basically be Biden and his crimes bill, right? And I'm guessing he's not going to want to run on that so much. So this notion that, well, you have to get something through the legislature entirely ignores the last 20 years of our history. Republicans have been obstructionist. They've opposed things under Democrats that they have then endorsed under Republicans, or vice versa. Look where they are on the debt, right? On national debt, it's an existential threat to America under Democratic presidents, and it's fine under Republican presidents. Look where they were on Romney Care before President Obama was office. Romney Care used to be something that was endorsed by Republicans as conservative as Mitt Romney. President Obama's in office, all of a sudden it's an evil. And even if you want to go back further, actually, I don't know what I was going to say there, so never mind. Anyway, my point is that this notion that they have to get stuff passed. Oh yeah, my point was that there is a real argument to be made for the idea that none of these Democrats are going to pass anything, centrist or otherwise, past a Republican-held chamber of Congress without creating a real movement, a real in the streets movement, so that enough Republicans are scared of losing their job the next time out that they either fall in line or they at least get out of the way. And you can make the argument that, Congressman Delaney is the one to fire people up to do that. But historically speaking, it's not been the centrist, middle of the road people who have done that. Although you can make the case that Obama did that, but he actually ran as less centrist and middle of the road than he ended up governing. So he was I would argue that he was more successful as a candidate in inspiring that movement, and then as a governing more from the center, at least historically from the center, didn't really capitalize on the energy, the movement energy of his campaign. And there are good pieces out there on exactly why that happened, and it wasn't necessarily a malicious thing. Large institutions and people are complicated engines, and they can go awry even in the absence of intention to do so. Okay, Travis Washington says, getting bills passed versus introducing bills shows just how much the GOP and establishment Dems don't care about the people. Bernie has introduced bills to help the people. Yeah, so Travis, I would reject the notion about establishment Dems don't care about the people. Establishment Dems, I don't think that's a helpful way of at least in this context. I think every Democrat, I think every politician in some way, in some permutation, thinks of themselves as wanting to help people. It's not a good feeling to think of yourself as not wanting to help people, right? In the story, we all are the hero of our own story. And I think if you're a politician, the hero of a political story is someone who tries to help people. So if you watch President Trump beyond the sound bites, you'll hear him talk about how much he cares about, the black people of Baltimore. And you may argue that his words and deeds prove otherwise, but in his head, that's the narrative he's following. So I don't think it's all that constructive or helpful for figuring out how to move forward to think of people as not wanting or not caring about people. That's my own personal view of politics. Devon Miller says, name one centrist policy that doesn't lead to massive unnecessary deaths. Well, I don't know. I get that you're being facetious there, but and I was trying to think of a funny example. I don't know, privatizing the post office. I don't know. Aesir is still yelling, so I'm going to skip that, I think. Let's see. Kellywana says, the reason anyone thinks Bernie is radical is because of the, quote, neutrality of the corporate media. For example, Jake Tapper asks Bernie, you are like Trump in war, aren't you? If voters are hearing the same message from you and President Trump on the issue of military intervention, how should they expect that you will be any different from him? So maybe you could flesh that out a little bit, Kellywana, because I think you're starting off saying that people think Bernie is radical because the corporate media is neutral, but then I'm not sure how I'm seeing that play out in the example you're giving regarding foreign policy. Let's see. Kellywana says, how can they keep getting away with this kind of treatment of Bernie and other popular ideas like legalization, etc.? They laugh and ignore and make up idiotic associations like Bernie is like 45. I guess I see what you're saying. So when we talk about getting away with, I'm not sure what that means. What would not getting away with look like? And I think there are a couple different ways that media could not get away with doing what you consider an inadequate job of treating Sanders, or I presume Warren or Buttigieg or anyone else advocating progressive policies unfairly. And the most extreme example, right, of course, is that the government steps in and boom, shuts it down, and Jake Tapper disappears and his name is erased from the history books. That's the most extreme example, and obviously no one, I hope, yet wants that. The more real world example of not getting away with it, I think, though, is a market-based answer, which would be people stop watching. And if you look at the numbers, that's what's happening, right? Fox, they all have their spikes. They tend to be Trump-driven spikes. But in general, they're going down. Trump, even Fox now has competition, One America News Network and others. So even though they're kind of riding on the money train that Trump has provided, I assure you that internally, if they're not already thinking about what happens the day after Election Day in 2020, they know that they should be. And they're a little bit nervous about not knowing how to proceed, especially if the irony is, if a centrist Democrat gets elected whose primary appeal is that they're boring, that's potentially a problem for cable news. If you look at prior to Obama and the rise of the Tea Party, and with all due modesty, the countdownification, the Keith Olbermannification of MSNBC, cable news broadly was hurting, with the exception of Fox News. And now even Fox News has to struggle sometimes. So they've got a different lineup than they used to. It's not clear that Tucker Carlson is going to be able to hold on to his advertisers. So they're all flush with cash, but they all know that their trajectory is downward. So when we say getting away with, I'm not sure they are getting away with. It's just a question of what does the arc of that not getting away with look like. That's my feeling. A Seer is yelling things in all caps again. Maybe if you could put it in lowercase, I wouldn't feel like I'm cheating by reading you. Bruce Homack, I hope I'm saying that correctly, says, question, at what point should Bernie be concerned that he is still only second place in the polls? So the question is, the answer is, I don't know, right? There is no right answer to that. And I also think it's not necessarily the kind of question we ought to be asking if we want a responsible civics discourse. If we want our news organizations, especially those that drive the civic discourse, to engage in the substance, then we shouldn't ask them horse race questions like, at what point should Bernie be concerned that he's only second in the polls? If you ask them a question like that, that's an easy thing to answer, because you can just make up stuff, right? Clearly next Monday is when he should be concerned. And I'll tell you why. And that's because Warren is coming up on his heels. And if he doesn't establish himself as the primary alternative to Joe Biden, then Warren's going to do it for him. Blah. See, I just made that up off the top of my head. It meant nothing. But had I said that on network TV, and had I been made up and wearing my network TV suit and knew how to speak appropriately and professionally on TV without saying all the time, then everyone at home would go, yeah, that's true. Warren's coming up fast. Bernie's got to make himself the number one alternative. And all the pundits around the table would say, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Or they would say, no, not at all. What Bernie's got to do, and then they'd come out with some other blather. It's easy to come up with this stuff. And that's all the more reason why we shouldn't, I think, incentivize them to do it. It's fine to want to know. And it's understandable to want to know. But what we've had with social media is a blurring of the questions that we ask our friends at the bar, around the water cooler, whatever cliche you want to use, right? God, when is Bernie gonna catch up to Biden? You know, that's fine when we're not participants in the social discourse. But once you're on social media, now the news are paying attention to you. Other people see you as indicative of X portion of the electorate, and now you're driving it. And so I don't think we as a society have fully reckoned with the fact that thanks to social media, when we talk about news, we're now news outlets, right? In a lot of respects, we are now serving that function. We are determining the agenda. We are an indicator of what matters. So we ought to, I think, exercise the same discretion that we aspire to, or we want the people who run the real news outlets to aspire to, right? Be serious. Distinguish between bullshit conversation and substantive, pay attention to this conversation. So I think, and we're not there yet. We're not there yet, right? I'd love to see something like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube start to make distinctions between what once would have been like front page or a section of your newspaper versus, the lifestyle section, where you understood that what you're reading isn't meant to drive the conversation. It's just some fluff to pass the time. And that's okay. We're allowed to have fluff to pass the time. The problem is that on social media, it's undifferentiated. And so when we see a story that is all about like when should Bernie be concerned about his standing in the polls, there's nothing external to tell us that's not an A1 story. That's a page filler in the back. That's a thumbsucker, as they used to call them. So we're going to have to get better at that. And it's not going to happen tomorrow or next year, and it's not going to happen quickly, but it's either going to happen or it's not. And if it's not, there's going to be, I think, real consequences for it, which, frankly, we've already seen to too great an extent. Let's see. Excuse me. Mr. Elder says, well, I hope everybody here plans to vote. Think of it as a civic duty that you have to do. I certainly broadly agree with that, although there's a perverse side of me that thinks, you know what? I don't think everybody should vote. I think people who have, I think people should vote the right way. I'm more interested in people voting the right way than I am just in any vote. It's not like, yay, that guy voted for Hitler, but it's a vote, just, anyway, that's my perverse contrarian side. Obviously, everyone should vote, but they should also do the real research beforehand, right? What was the Jefferson phrase? Something like an educated populace is something, something, something. Let's see. Mr. Dawn says, I live in Trump country. I live in Trump country, surrounded by the Trumpnetized. So I just wanted to say how much I look forward to your segments. Oh, thank you so much. Hearing someone speak sensibly about current events is sanity saving. Well, that's a little bit more of a burden than I'm willing to accept, but that's very kind of you to say. And I do think that I'm not one of these people who says, I stay in touch with what Trump voters are thinking because I drive out to the red states and I talk to people. I don't think you can do that all you want and still filter it through your pre-existing worldviews and come up with an interpretation that fits your narrative. So I don't think that's necessarily the cure-all. I do think it's important, to go back to what I said earlier, to not necessarily assume that everyone's good. Everyone is not good, but to realize that evil is a bad explanatory mechanism, broadly speaking, and that most people do not do things because they think, well, I'm an evil person and I'm hoping to do as much evil as I can today, so therefore I'm going to do this. So I think it's important, and I tried to do this under President Bush as well, when he was doing things that I thought were manifestly, clearly very, 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 very bad ideas. And I talked to political journalists about this at the time, and I spoke to one political journalist whose name you would have recognized 20 years ago, and I said, liberals back in the 70s, Democrats, the left generally, they took the idea that crime, right, street crime, kid bashes an old lady in the head for her purse, they took the idea that was the result of evil, and they questioned it, they challenged it, and they said we have to think about that kid's social environment, their upbringing, what their incentives are, how they come to view other people, and realize that these behaviors arise from a broader social context. And the same thing is true of United States presidents, right? And so I think just as it was evil was a crappy explanatory mechanism for why poor kids, and obviously evil was a dehumanizing thing that was used especially against young criminals of color, black men, young black men certainly got that a hell of a lot more than white criminals did. Look at the Central Park Five. It was that even after liberals started to say we can't dehumanize criminals, we have to grapple with them as human beings, we still got the Central Park Five. So, but I think just as valid as that is for people who commit what we recognize as street crime, that's also true of people who commit what we consider war crimes. That's also true of people who commit what we consider racism in the Oval Office, right? I think it's important to grapple with all of those people as if they're the hero of their own story and look at what incentives, disincentives, worldviews, mindsets lead them to those actions. Chris MC says there should be an IQ requirement for voting. I think we all know how that kind of thing can get twisted in an ugly fashion pretty quickly. I think I understand the sentiment, and I'm not saying I'm immune to it, but that's not a good idea. Kalita says, I'm not planning to vote, actually. I'm not sure why people don't vote, but I will address what someone else who I like and respect has said in the past, who has talked about not voting. And I want to explain why he's wrong, and maybe his thinking applies to you, in which case you also are wrong, and I would ask you to stop being wrong. This friend of mine, when he talks about not voting, he talks about the other person not deserving his vote. And that's infantile. Our vote is not a precious sacred thing. It's not our virginity that we're handing over to the most deserving suitor. It's just a choice we have to make in life, right? If we come to an intersection and we need to go either way because we're eventually going catty-corner to the other side, we don't think, well, we wait and see which one turns green first, and then we go that way because that's the best choice for us at the moment. It's not, oh, well, this green light obviously deserves my vote, and I'm willing to bestow upon it the wonders of glory that are associated with my vote, and I'm willing to besmirch the sacred purity of my sacred holy vote by giving it away to this one because they are chaste and just and virtuous. Grow up, right? There's nothing holy or sacred or pure about your vote. When you are faced with a choice, no matter how awful, you make the least bad choice. You do that in the primary, you do that in the general. If the reason you don't vote is because your vote is some magically precious sacred thing that you must not taint with opposition to the world court, or just to make up an example, right? You are in favor of environmentally sound tariffs, and so you can't besmirch that by giving your vote to someone who opposes that. That's not how life works. When we go to a menu, when we go to a restaurant, we look at the menu, we don't think, none of these foods deserve my vote. We think, I'm hungry, I need to eat something eventually, and I will always, in deciding what to eat, choose the thing that is not going to kill me, that is closest to what I like. Why? Because we don't see our eating choices as this holy thing that we bestow upon Arby's. Okay? So this whole notion that the vote is sacred as opposed to, it's a choice that we have to make in our lives like any other. And if we're smart about it and we do the research and we get involved, maybe we can improve the choices we're faced with. But either way, to not vote because neither of the choices you have, or any of the 3 or 18 or 22 choices that you have earned it, it's just an infantile way of looking at things, and it's a way, and we can know that it's infantile because we don't apply that reasoning to anything else. Maybe the closest we come to with that is in our romantic lives in terms of who we want to go out with. And that's fine, because you know what? You don't have to go out with anyone. That's not a choice you have to make. So that's my way of saying, please do the work and then vote responsibly. Okay. HSR Adama says, do you think the moderators have an obligation to be fair, or can we expect more of the same going forward? Again, I think they think they're being fair. And I didn't watch it, so I can't say that they're not being fair. The question, I think, isn't are they being fair, but more what are the systemic problems that they're grappling with, right? They didn't create the format. They didn't create the timing. They didn't create the producing and editorial mandates that they got. And no, I don't mean that Jeff Zucker said, well, you have to ask this because I own stock in that company. That's not the kind of thing I mean. I mean, producing wise, someone probably said, well, we can't let these things go long because then it's boring and then we don't get good ratings, right? That kind of pernicious thinking. And plus, we don't get good ratings because we don't know how to get good ratings when it gets more substantive, even though the biggest, most highest rated news stories outside of politics do get high ratings exactly when they go into the weeds. They get into the weeds and they talk about the substance of it. So I think that's more important than the, being fair, etc. Travis Washington says, Trump isn't evil. He's narcissistic, crooked, greedy, and self-serving, and his words and actions reflect that. His actions make minorities' very existence dangerous to just live. And certainly we've talked about that before, but I'm not going to dispute the things you've said about him. But again, most of us have an element of some of those in us. Narcissistic, we're all narcissistic to some degree. Crooked, tons of Americans cheat on their taxes or, do little things like that. Greedy, guilty, self-serving, guilty. So again, I would say it's not good enough, I think, to just reject evil and go with being more specific about the evil. It's looking at how is it self-serving? Why are they rewarded for it? And how are they able to rewrite the story in their head so that they're not narcissistic, crooked, greedy, or self-serving, right? They think they're not. Very few people think they are in those circumstances. So it's important we're not gonna do away with those dynamics in our politics until we recognize what they are and how they come into play. Again, I think. All right, Kalita says I'm not from the US, just to clarify. In that case, it's good that you're not voting, right? If you're not a citizen, you're not legally eligible to vote, I should explain that, yes, I do not think you should be voting. I'm not part of the vast, I'm kidding, Democratic conspiracy, I'm kidding, to enroll millions, I'm kidding, of undocumented immigrants, I'm kidding, to somehow flood the voting booths without being caught. Okay. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there because I'm starting to play the familiar hits from my limited bag of resources here and things that I have to say. So if I didn't ask you already, I'll ask you now. If you think what I've had to say here is worthwhile today, any other time here on TYTI Daily, any of the other videos we post, I hope you'll share it. I hope you'll subscribe here on YouTube, like and follow us on Facebook, where we've got some stories coming up that we'll post there as well. And of course, we'll post some commentary and interviews related to them here on YouTube. And either way, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you tomorrow here on TYTI Daily.